My name is Adam Ruben, and thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it, especially considering there's a showing of Dark Crystal down the hallway. So thank you. And half the people leave now to go see that. Great. Really pleased to be here at Balticon, and thank you also to the National Capital Area Skeptics who invited me to come and speak, in particular J.D. Mack and Marv Zelkowitz, and everybody who's put together every talk. Enough of thanking people. Here's the talk. So, I am a biologist. I'm a molecular biologist. That's my profession. I did my PhD at Johns Hopkins, just down the road from here. And while I was there, I had sort of a double life. I was working in a biology lab as a graduate student, but at the same time, I was adjunct faculty in the English department. And that was easy enough to do because the English department was looking for anyone who knew anything about science to teach kids how to write about science. So for 13 semesters, I taught a class called Public Perception of Science to undergraduates at Johns Hopkins. This talk is basically the 50 to 55-minute version of that one semester-long class. Updated, because it's been a while since I've done that. So just a little bit more about my background and things that I do in communicating science to the public. I've been on a number of television shows, including Mysteries at the Kremlin, which is weird. I get a random phone call saying, can you go on the Travel Channel and talk about this weird Russian scientist in the 20s who tried to make a hybrid human chimp? And so, sure enough, that's me talking about the human chimp. The show that I'm on now that maybe some of you have seen is Outrageous Acts of Science. It's on the Science Channel. It's actually a really good show, really interesting show. We have a bunch of actual scientists making fun of YouTube clips. So, wonderful premise. And in the past, I've been on some other shows, and I learned from doing this that science on television is really hit or miss. When I was on the show Food Detectives, hosted by Ted Allen, you guys have heard of Ted Allen perhaps? He hosts a show called Chopped. Chopped is his successful show. At the time, Food Detectives was the other show he was on. It was like Mythbusters about food science. And so when they were putting episodes together, I must have been like the only scientist they'd ever met. Because they would call and ask questions like, we need to grow bacteria for this experiment comparing wooden versus plastic cutting boards and which one's safer. So tell us what kind of an incubator we would need for that. And I tell him, and the producer, this guy Danny, called me and he said, okay, I think we found a great incubator. Should we buy this one? Let me email you the specs. And I looked at it and I said, yeah, good, that'll work. He said, great, because the guy who's selling it to me says it's a really good incubator. He says it holds temperature in Fahrenheit and Celsius. Yeah, thank you for understanding what's wrong with that. Because no one at the Food Network did. I should have said, send it back. I need one that can do kelvins. And you know how many people at the Food Network would have understood what a Kelvin is? Absolutely zero. Oh, okay, you got those.
But it's a refrigerator.
Yes. It's an anti-incubator. So I had a weird little web series for a while where I talked about grad school and illustrated principles of grad school using toddler toys. It was through the Journal of Visualized Experiments. And I have fun with liquid nitrogen in front of children on occasion. So a few other things. I actually work at a real job. This is my lab. We don't have the whole building. We have a teeny part of that building. It's in Rockville, just maybe an hour down the road. And the company's called Scenaria. We're making a malaria vaccine based on the whole organism approach. It's actually really promising, really interesting. I'm not going to talk about it today at all. I've written a book called Surviving Your Stupid Decision to Go to Grad School, published by Random House in 2010. And actually, I'm very excited because just yesterday, I got the word that I've found a publisher for my second book, which is going to be on my other obsession, which maybe one or two of you have any interest in, which is pinball. A couple people, yes. So in spring of 2017, look for a book about pinball. It's mine, if I write it between now and then. I have a column in the AAAS journal Science, their subjournal Careers, called Experimental Error. It's a monthly science humor column. And I did a weird little stage show making fun of science presentations, a bunch of stuff. And as a result of all this, I've gotten to go all around the country and all around Europe even, giving talks like this one. I'm actually going to be in Tucson in a couple weeks, speaking at the Society for In Vitro Biology meeting about public perception of science and also about the horrors of graduate school, which is also not going to be the topic of today's talk. Because today's talk is about what happens when a scientific discovery is made and announced. And we scientists have a completely flawed perception of what happens. We think that a scientist discovers something, announces it to the world, and the world goes, yay! Thank you, scientist. Not at all what happened. And so when I was the idea for teaching this class about public perception of science came to me when I was still an undergraduate. I was in my lab, and I was listening to NPR, and it was 2000. It was June of 2000. And NPR's Talk of the Nation was talking about how they had just finished sequencing the human genome. And I thought people were going to call in and say, this is terrific, this is wonderful, thank you, great scientists. And instead people called in and said over and over again, you shouldn't have done that. I've gone back and Googled some quotes from that particular episode of Talk of the Nation. Here's one that I found that I think illustrates what a lot of people said. Pete in St. Louis called in and said, this is actually a little disturbing. Do you want to be able to program and control human beings and alter them to how we see fit, to have control over that and be able to manipulate it for war purposes or what have you? And this really shows a lot about the undercurrent of what people were fearing when scientists had announced what should have been a controversy-free scientific discovery. So what informs our perception of science? Where does all of that come from? A lot of places. Educators, the people who tell you in school what to believe and what to think. The fact-based media, so media sources that are supposed to be objective. The opinion-based media sources that never claim to be objective. But I'll show you how even those have, when there are inaccuracies buried in those can propagate throughout society. Fiction-based media, science fiction, you guys. Cultural cues of all kinds, and of course scientists themselves and what the public hears from us. So this is an example that I think a lot of you have probably heard of, and so I'm not going to do to you what I do to the undergraduates. But for you guys, I'll just tell you the punchline at the beginning, which is, as I'm sure like 90% of you know, there's something called the Coalition to Ban Dihydrogen Monoxide. Dihydrogen monoxide is a chemical. Everything on this slide about it is true. It's also known as hydroxyl acid, causes severe burns at high temperatures, accelerates corrosion and rusting of metals. Many athletes who have been implicated in doping scandals have been found to use dihydrogen monoxide on a regular basis.
And it's really bad stuff.
It's bad stuff. The Navy has been storing vast quantities of dihydrogen monoxide for use in war. I mean, and you hear all these things, they're all true, and then I tell the students, by the way, dihydrogen monoxide is another name for water. But before I tell them that, I give them a quick quiz to say, okay, based on that, do you think the use of this chemical should be regulated, allowed, or banned? And now this is Johns Hopkins. These are pretty intelligent students. Most of them are biology majors when I go back and give a guest lecture with this. And so I would say a good half to 3/4 of them have heard of dihydrogen monoxide and heard of the dihydrogen monoxide hoax thing before. But there's still always a scarily large number that think, well, we really ought to have some regulation on this. And even a few people every time think that dihydrogen monoxide ought to be banned. The Coalition to Ban Dihydrogen Monoxide is, of course, an old joke. It's like an internet joke that predates the internet. It goes back to 1990 at the UC Santa Cruz campus when a couple of undergraduates circulated a contamination warning just for fun and founded the Coalition to Ban DHMO 4 years later, again, just as a joke. And it reached the public consciousness 3 years after that when Nathan Zahner in the Greater Idaho Falls Science Fair got 43 of his classmates to sign a petition banning dihydrogen monoxide and won first prize at the science fair for a science project called How Gullible Are We? A question that he answered very handily. Now, this would be a fun little joke if it weren't for the fact that it keeps coming up in the real world. Just 11 years ago in California, there was a big deal in Aliso Viejo, California, when they actually considered banning styrofoam cups from their stadium, which they should have anyway, partially because dihydrogen monoxide was used in their production. Then, exactly 2 weeks later, in Bremerton, Washington, completely independently, a Seattle radio station did an April Fool's Day joke about DHMO in the water supply. And the city officials went nuts all morning, and they eventually blamed it on, quote unquote, a paralegal who did bad research. And for a while, these are the only two examples I had in my slideshow when I would go back to Hopkins and give this as a guest lecture. But look, happened again. April 2013, another April Fool's Day joke, actually got a couple of DJs suspended because they told listeners in Fort Myers that DHMO is in their water supply too, and freaked out the public. So dihydrogen monoxide, fun little example, but it shows exactly how quick people are to be afraid of something just because it sounds science-y and chemical-y. And that comes from the fact that not a lot of people understand a lot about science. This is a survey from 2008, mind you, 7 years ago. Not long ago. Only half of the people in the country in which we all reside are aware of how long it takes the Earth to orbit the sun. 41% think The Flintstones is a documentary. And more than 99% did not know what percentage of the Earth's water is fresh, which you may not know, but you should have at least gotten close to it. But nearly half said, well, I'm not even going to guess. So it is a recurring theme in public opinion surveys and public attitude surveys that we don't know enough about science. I love this quote from Carl Sagan that I thought was also appropriate because it's a sci-fi convention. We've designed our civilization based on science and technology, and at the same time arranged things so that almost no one understands anything at all about science and technology. This is a clear prescription for disaster. That disaster struck in an example that I spend an entire month on in my class that will be the bulk of this presentation, and that is something you may have noticed from the title and from the background of every slide, the 1996 cloning of Dolly the Sheep. Before we get to that, here is one last opinion survey that, again, I won't inflict on you because I think you guys will actually pass with flying colors. But I asked this at the undergrads at Hopkins, and here's how this works. I asked them, okay, 3 categories. I'm going to name a human reproductive biotechnology, and I should actually say that I stole this survey from my professor in undergraduate at Princeton, Lee Silver. This is his survey, not mine, but it worked then and it works now. I'm going to name reproductive biotechnology. You tell me whether everyone should be allowed to use it without restriction, whether it should only be used by infertile couples incapable of procreating by any other means, or if it should just be banned across the board. So first, IVF, in vitro fertilization. And we let the students vote. They actually have, in class at Hopkins, they have little clickers that they have to buy. And so some of you are nodding, so you're familiar with the clickers. Many of you are probably college professors, come to think of it. And so they vote with the clickers, and we see what the result is. This first one is just sort of to throw them off, and also to point out that the results now that IVF has been out and in the world for, 1978 plus this, 37 years, most people approve of IVF. We know that it's not creating weird Frankensteins, it's creating human beings who walk among us, possibly some people in this room. So it's a perfectly normal, natural procedure used on hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people. But at the time, in 1978, 3/4 of the people surveyed in any attitude survey you looked at said, this is scary, weird, we don't want test tube babies, this is science going too far. Okay, that's number one. Number 2, the use of cloning technology to produce human children. And then they vote. This is usually mixed as well. A few people say yes, many say infertile couples only, and many say it should be banned. The third one, a woman being allowed to produce and carry to term an embryo that contains genetic material obtained entirely from one of her own cells. Now, in this case, some of you know where this is going, which is why I didn't do this to you guys. In this case, a lot of the people, now I should say, this technology has a name, and that name, as some of you know, is cloning. This is cloning. But usually, and any time I do this, about half the people who say that cloning should be banned change their mind when they read this third one. They say, well, cloning, no. But this thing, yeah, that's okay. But this is what cloning is. And a lot of people don't understand what it is. So enter Dolly. The year was 1996, but really the year was 1997, because Dolly was cloned in 96, but the results of her cloning were not published until February of 97. That's the way science publication works. Now, here is how ordinary biological maturation works in a very, very scaled down, oversimplified way. You start out as one cell. That cell has a nucleus containing DNA. That cell is the egg. After the sperm fuses with the egg becomes 2 cells, which become 4, et cetera, and ultimately go to become the 1 trillion or so cells that make up you. They just realize this is a terrible piece of clip art because that person has no genitals. But imagine that's a real person. So every cell in your body still has that same squiggly DNA that was in that first cell. with some tiny exceptions and little things here and there. So the idea behind cloning is, what if you start with one of your cells right now, say a square cell, a square skin cell, and you take someone else's egg, you remove the DNA, call it an enucleated egg, an egg with no nucleus, and move your DNA over to that egg and give it a little shock to start it dividing, and et cetera, 2 cells, 4 cells, and so forth. That's what cloning basically is. You know, every cell in your body has the same recipe book, but it knows to become a skin cell or a hair cell or a tooth cell or a tumor cell, because that recipe book has, in some cases, this recipe is made 40 times, this recipe is made not at all, and in some cases this recipe is made 100 times, this one not at all. So that's how it works. That's what cloning is. Identical twins have the same DNA as each other, and so I thought that the best way to think of cloning is a clone is an identical twin born a generation later. That's basically what a clone is. And so I ask my students then, pop quiz, and actually I'll ask you guys, because I think I'll get it right anyway, this one's quick. If I were to clone you right now, and you are 18 years old, exactly 18 years old today, how old will your clone be 1 year from today? 1 is the, aha, see, there you go. Well, you all skipped right over the wrong guessed answer, which is 19. And some of you said the wrong answer, 1 year old, and of course the right answer is about two or three months. Because, why? Well, if I clone you, you need to gestate. Exactly, you have to be inside a woman. The whole artificial womb thing in a machine in a room exists in the novel Brave New World and not in reality. So you can't clone someone and boom, instantly they're a clone. Some myths about cloning that are out there in the public sphere and are widespread. The clone is an exact copy of the original. Well, the clone is, for the most part, an exact genetic copy of the original, but excuse me, that does not make it the same organism as the original. And you can see that very clearly in the example of Cece. Cece is the world's first cloned cat. She was cloned in 2002. The first thing you notice about Cece is that she's really cute. She's so cute. Cece was short for copycat or carbon copy because they thought of 2 clever names and really couldn't come up with one, so they called her Cece. This is Cece with her surrogate mother, the cat in whose womb she gestated. And this is Rainbow, the genetic progenitor, the genetic mother, the cat from whom Cece was cloned. And what you notice immediately here is that Cece doesn't even look like the cat she was cloned from. But if they're genetically the same, if they're identical twins genetically, wouldn't you think that they'd at least look the same? And well, similar fur markings, but not the same. Calico versus tortoiseshell. And the answer is that a lot about cat fur color is determined as early as in the womb. And so even as early as pre-birth, you can see that clones are different from the being from which they were cloned. There's another myth that cloning involves manipulation of genetic traits. I don't know why. There are pictures of giant roosters, there's a famous hoax of the giant grasshopper that's not about cloning, but there's all kinds of other stuff where you think of cloning and you think of making a super soldier. But that's the opposite of cloning. That's genetic engineering. Cloning means making the same. Army of clones. An army of clones. Well, what I tell my students is if you want to make an army of 100,000 clones, what's the first ingredient you're going to need? 100,000 women, exactly. 100,000 women, each willing to bring and gestate and bring to term in their womb a random baby. And then you're going to have an army of 100,000 babies that you have to raise for 18 years and convince to join your army. So sorry to break it to those of you who consider this to be very close to reality. You can't make an army of clones. Or at least it's not as efficient as the method we have now for making an army. So on to Dolly. When Dolly was announced, so first of all, they had Dolly gestate inside a very different looking sheep, just to sort of visually, strikingly show that when she was born, she was not the daughter of that sheep. Dolly's creation / birth was published in Nature, February 97, Nature, February 27th. And the interesting thing is, if you read this article, the whole article, and I don't recommend you do, because like all scientific articles, it's really boring, you will see that they use the term cloned, cloning, clones, cloners, a grand total of 0 times. They never even said clone, even though that's what they did. They say somatic cell nuclear transfer. That's the technical term for it, somatic cell nuclear of the nucleus transfer. They move the nucleus over. So it's a somatic cell nuclear transfer, or SCNT. Ian Wilmot was sort of the public face of all of this. And let's see what happened in the public. So I'm going to show you just one magazine cover at first, because in all the research I've done on Dolly and the public reaction to Dolly, this one cover sums up graphically 4 of the main things that the rest of the media did. It's Time magazine, very good. So what do we notice about this cover? Well, first of all, there's the sheep, second exactly identical friggin' sheep. Now, obviously they're not saying they put Dolly in a photocopier, but there's that tremendous implication, and it's only reinforcing in the minds of people who already think that's what cloning is. So you've got, that's sort of the big one there. What's the next one?
Human cloning.
Human cloning. There's the jump to human cloning. So almost every article about Dolly said they cloned a sheep. Yes, yes, yes. What if they cloned you? And that was a big undercurrent in a lot of things. I don't know how well you can see in this projector. What's in the background? A ton of other little sheep faces. This sheep face in miniature all over. The implication being you can make 1, you can make 2, you can make an army of clones. I also think, and this is purely incidental and no one's fault, that it didn't help that Dolly, of all animals, happened to be a sheep, which we think of as animals that are obedient, docile, factory line kind of animals. Then the last thing is this inclusion here of a fiction bonus, Clone on the Range by Douglas Coupland, which I've read, and if you're a fan of science fiction, you can skip it, because it's not that good. But basically, it's all 4 things. So there's nothing inappropriate about putting fiction in Time magazine. They do it all the time. But, but you will see that there's that feeling of science fiction underlying everything. It wasn't just here's a scientific advance. It was, okay, folks, here's the scientific advance that you've got to know about. And actually, what almost no one seemed to know, and what I didn't even know until I read this, is that Dolly was not even the first cloned mammal. She was not even the first cloned sheep, because the same researchers a year earlier had cloned and brought to term 2 sheep named Megan and Morag. But Megan and Morag were cloned from an embryonic stem cell, whereas Dolly was cloned from an adult cell. So Dolly got much more press because, here I could clone you as opposed to cloning your egg. Der Spiegel in Germany was a bit less subtle. Germans are not known for their subtlety. So here you have Dolly, and of course the implication is if you can clone Dolly, well, you could clone Hitler, Einstein, or I'm told that's Claudia Schiffer. What a strange collection of people to choose. I mean, well, Hitler and Einstein, maybe you can see. Anyway. So, and if you translate the German, it roughly translates to science on the way to cloned people, and Der Sündenfall is the fall of man. So again, not pulling any punches there in Germany. It was the same situation for poor Cece. And now Cece was 5 years later than Dolly. This is 2002. The media used many images when talking about Cece. These are media images pulled from online articles that would accompany an article about the birth of Cece. So here you have Cece in a beaker, implying she's a product of science and not of nature. Here you have Cece looking in a mirror as though she's asking, should I be? And this, I think, is the worst one. This is from February of 2002 from the BBC. It's not even the right cat. And it's probably the worst photoshopping job I've ever seen. This looks worse than the 2 Dollys. Anyway, so some headlines about Dolly, just to see what the world was saying in February of 1997. Washington Post, page A1. Scottish scientists clone adult sheep. Semicolon techniques used with humans is feared. So you're going right to that. Toronto Star, this is Dolly the clone, the daughter of none. A genetic marvel spawns potential ethical nightmare. The Irish Times, hello Dolly, bye-bye daddy, as first cloned animal set to meet the world. Meaning, of course, you don't need men to reproduce anymore. Don't tell my wife. The Independent of London, first cloned lamb paves way for life by production lines. We're getting closer and closer to this Brave New World scenario, which was mentioned many times. And of course, there are no shortage of sheep puns. Sheep puns, the EWE and YOU is the most popular one. Cloners U-turn stuns. Actually, that's not even YOU, that's just the letter U. Scottish scientists use cells of sheep, create exact copy. And again, look, all of these, page A01, page A1, page 1. This was big news. It was all over the world. Here's an editorial from page 1, or sorry, not page 1, from page 6 of USA Today, written by a man named Craig Wilson. I'm only going to show you one line from it because this line really, it asks a question that needn't be asked. Clone murders could become commonplace, but what happens then? Are you charged with murder or suicide? So this is an editorial. To be or not to be, one of each of us is enough. And he's talking about how you don't even like yourself some days, but what if you're just sitting there when 3 more of you walk in? And I would like to think that people read this and said, well, murder's stupid. But you know the world in which we live. We live in a country where 40% of the people think that humans and dinosaurs are friends. So you know people are reading this and thinking, great question. Wow, Craig Wilson, you asked the tough questions that none of these scientists are willing to ask. This, of course, is the Weekly World News, which has no real relevance to what we're talking about, but I love it. Weekly World News, the Elvis impersonators on a planet, collision course with Earth, weekly supermarket tabloid. Their take on Dolly was that Dolly kills a lamb and eats it. And here is a concerned Reverend Bob Tweeney who says that you stare into her red eyes and you know she wants to kill again. This is Dolly the Sheep today. She has left this mortal coil. She is her wool has been made into a sweater that's in a British museum. And Dolly was born in 96, announced in 97. She started showing various metabolic defects and she got sick pretty often. And they started noticing that around 2000. In 2003, they decided to put her out of her misery and they euthanized Dolly. However, the diseases to which she was susceptible, the diseases she was getting, they have said are not really that different from the kind of diseases a sheep might just get. And so, was there something different about Dolly because she was a clone? There's never been a definitive answer for that. There have been theories about the telomeres and whatnot that we won't really get into, that she is kind of pre-aged, but none of that's been really proven. But you can see even on the sweater that Dolly has become, you still have the same sheep motif. 1 + 1 = 2! Exclamation point down here. Yay, we've got 2, and then you've got sheep divided and doubling of sheep. And so poor Dolly is now still a victim of this public perception problem. So cloning came back into the headlines again a couple years ago. Some of you may remember seeing articles just 2013 about the gastric brooding frog. This is the first cloning of an extinct animal. The gastric brooding frog has been extinct since I believe the 70s, but they have some stored samples that they were able to bring back and have them gestate on other frogs. And anyway, called the gastric brooding frog because it broods its young in its mouth, which makes for a creepy picture no matter what. But the fact was, it was extinct in the 70s, and now it exists thanks to cloning. However, let's see some headlines from 2013. Scientists cloning think frog, Jurassic Park, here we come. That's The Guardian. New York Times, so you're extinct? Scientists have gleam in eye. How many people in this world trust the scientists with a gleam in their eye? And, of course, the French Tribune, from dead to alive, science magic. And so we've talked a bit about what people do and don't understand about science. And I wanted to include this because I just saw this a couple months ago. Maybe some of you saw this as well. It was big on Facebook. A survey was performed. How many of you saw this on Facebook and clicked on it? I didn't click on it. Oh, good. Well, it was big clickbait. Over 80% of Americans support mandatory labels on foods containing DNA. And it became just sort of an obvious story about how stupid is the public that they don't do this. And it came from something called the Food Demand Survey at Oklahoma State, and they had it in a bunch of questions about food attitudes. So I have the list of questions here. You can't really read them too well, but basically, do you support or oppose the following? A tax on sugared sodas, a ban on the sale of marijuana, ban on the sale of unpasteurized milk, a lot of things. And then right over here, right between mandatory calorie labels on restaurant menus and mandatory labels on foods produced with genetic engineering, you've got mandatory labels on foods containing DNA. And somehow 80.44% of the people oppose it. But I have a friend named Ben Lilly who runs an organization that does science storytelling, great science storytelling in Brooklyn called Story Collider. And he wrote a really great Tumblr post that ended up going pretty far across the internet, where he said, wait, let's all calm down. Do we really believe that 80% of Americans want mandatory labels on foods containing DNA? And he found a survey from the University of Michigan where they showed that this is one of the concepts, scientific concepts, that people really do understand pretty well. 85% of American adults know that all plants and animals have DNA. So why in the world would they support mandatory labeling? And it raises a lot of interesting questions, such as, does it have something to do with the way you're reading these? When you read these, now remember, I should also point out, these were randomized for everybody, but even so, in the context of innocuous things, things where you expect there might be a controversy, you might automatically have your brain go to the controversy and assume that it means some kind of weird DNA. Yes?
Or perhaps they'd rather have labels on foods saying that, just confirm that it does have DNA.
That's true. You come across that one food that does not contain DNA, you're like, okay, I'm not eating this. What the hell this is? Ben even pointed out that bottled water would have this label because it might have very small levels of bacteria in it, which contain DNA. Okay, so why do people have these thoughts? Why do people think all these things about science? And I think to ask that question, you have to ask, what do people think about scientists? Because again, there's that assumption that people think scientists are doing good work. If you Google scientist and click on image search, and I just did this 2 weeks ago, I always update it. I did this, no, it wasn't even 2 weeks ago, sorry, it was just this week. You get this. This is the first page. So what do we see? Well, you can see that people think scientists are predominantly white male chemists. Exactly. So yes, I mean there are exceptions. You've got a woman looking at a microscope here, and here you've got scientists of both genders. You don't have anybody who's not white. Again, it's just the first page, and if you scroll down, I'm sure you'll see other things as well. And you don't have any geologists. I don't see any astronomers.
Smaller portraits under famous. Some of them, the ones that are not Einstein, some of them might be.
Right,
something.
that's true. But you'd have to click on the subcategory of famous. And if you look at what the subcategories are, clip art in the lab, famous scientist in a lab coat, mad. We are one of only 2 professions that is prefixed with the word mad, the other one being hatters. And there are not that many hatters nowadays, haberdashers, I guess. You don't have any friends in college who are like, oh yeah, I'm pre-hat. No. So Google is a great way to show you what people think about scientists, and you can use the Google autocomplete to show the same thing. So you just start typing something in and let Google show you what the most common next things are. Why are scientists concerned about invasive species? Great. Why are scientists atheists? Oh, well, why are scientists liberal? Scientists are so stupid. Why are scientists so important? Why are scientists so arrogant? Why are they so interested in solar neutrinos? I think that one came up because so appears in solar. I think that's what that's all about. You have to look closely to see that part's not bold, the so. So that explains that. Do scientists, what do people want to know after the words do scientists? Do scientists believe in God? Do scientists believe in ghosts? Do scientists believe in evolution? Do scientists believe in Bigfoot? This is Google telling you what most people want to know. You can see a little bit more about why, what people think about scientists and also how to change it by something brilliant that was done first in 1983 that some of you might be familiar with called the Draw a Scientist test. And so they asked kids, draw a scientist. These are from the original 1983 study, which was published in a journal called Science Education. And someone named D.W. Chambers asked students to draw a scientist, and this is mostly what they got. Bearded and mustached people, but then again, it was the early 80s, so everybody was. But again, white male chemists and kind of crazy white male chemists. Here you have the scientist looking victorious above a door that says, "Keep out, monster inside." Although actually it says monster inside, so maybe he's making non-DNA cheese in there. Oh yeah, that's what it is. Keep out, the monsters are inside. So there was the last line of this paper in Science Education I think was very interesting. And so I'm just going to put it up here verbatim. In almost every 3rd to 5th grade class tested, at least one child, and occasionally as many as 4 or 5, drew signs on the doors and walls of the laboratory bearing messages such as keep out, private, do not enter, go away, and top secret. The implication is that not only do people think scientists are crazy white male chemists, people think scientists are other. Scientists are someone keeping them out. It's not a profession that they could dream of being. Now, for a lot of us, I'm very lucky that my mother's a scientist, and I grew up in a household where a scientist was something that you could be, the same way you could be a policeman or a fireman or a baseball player or whatever professions people name. But to a lot of people, being a scientist someday is as plausible in their minds as growing up to become a cloud. It's just not something that you think of. You have
I'm just wondering where the study was done, because I live near a non-existent government facility.
Don't say that to this room of people. They'd be like, oh, we're going to... So,
Anyway, if a kid had parents who worked there, I could see why they'd have the secret sign.
yes. No, that is true, but there are a lot of questions that surround this that actually are addressed in the paper that I'm not going to get into. Things like, well, don't you think the students would draw their science teacher? Don't you think the students, male students are likelier to draw male figures just because if you tell students to draw a person, the boys will always draw a boy, you know, stuff like, and half the girls will draw a boy. And that's what they found in these as well.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, they all draw Neil
Today they all draw Neil deGrasse Tyson, exactly. Which would actually blow away all of the stereotypes in those pictures. So this is actually something that's been done and redone and redone, and I have a friend in Baltimore City who does the same thing with her students. I forget what grade she teaches. I think it might be 3rd or 4th grade, actually. And she asks the students to draw a scientist, but then she has them go meet some scientists. And then she brings them back and says, draw a scientist. And I've lost her drawings. I don't have them, but I've stole some others from the internet. This is kids visiting Fermilab in 2000. And before, you got the same things. The nerd with the big glasses, the male white chemist. This time the chemist potion is exploding, because that's what they do. I don't know who has time to do all these buttons on the lab coat. And this guy's like, yeah, I'm a scientist, what? So after they go to Fermilab and meet scientists of all kinds, they meet women, for example, and they draw women afterwards. And in this case, his scientist looks like a wrestler, basically. I don't know quite what happened there, but they also have the students write afterwards. What did you learn? And I'm just going to give one example because they all fall along the same lines. This one student before wrote, a scientist looks like a person who's in their 30s to 50s, has glasses, and is somewhat balding. And after one visit to a laboratory, wrote, the scientists were like me when I was little. The scientists played sports, hung out with their friends, and also did not get straight A's in every subject. And so it's that sort of reinforcing that scientists are people, that scientists look like people, that there are scientists of every kind.
I was just going to say that on the previous slides, that age group of like 2nd to 3rd graders is really critical.
Yeah.
Because they've done surveys with students, and by about the age of 12, they have formed their vision of what science is and whether or not they like it. So by 12, if they like science, they'll keep liking it. If they hate science, they'll keep hating it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so if those of you who have any influence over small children, as creepy as I've just phrased it, bring them to a lab and show them what science. I remember when I was about 12, they took us on a field. It wasn't the first time I'd seen science, but they took us on a field trip to, I think, the University of Delaware Engineering School, where we thought they were like big scientists showing us around. In retrospect, they were probably grad students. But we didn't know. We just knew that they were in a lab and playing with things and having fun. There's a slide I took out of this for time, but I probably could have kept it in, of what I'm calling the Ferdowsi effect. Some of you have heard of Bobak Ferdowsi. He was also known as Mohawk Guy when JPL landed its Mars rover. And for a while, science became cool again, according to the headlines on CNN. Science is cool again because one of the people landing the Mars rover had a mohawk. But it's not because mohawks are associated with coolness, it's because it looked like the guy was a regular guy having fun. And he said, yeah, my friends told me to do this mohawk for the thing, so I did. And his friends were high-fiving him, and people saw for just a moment that scientists are human beings. And then the media went nuts with it and said, science is cool again. Yeah?
Yeah, but you know, grad students and farmers can also be scientists.
Oh, absolutely.
Very valuable.
Absolutely. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I was making fun of grad students partially because if you missed the beginning, I've written a book called Surviving Your Stupid, Stupid Decision to Go to Grad School. And it's grad students are an easy target, let's be honest. But yes, of course. And there's, in fact, just last weekend I went to SERC, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center here in Maryland, which is a wonderful place where they're getting a lot of people involved in citizen science projects. And you can go there and measure things in a stream and contribute the data to actual scientific research. So yes, anyone is a scientist. So just to wrap up, and then if we have 1 or 2 minutes left for any more questions, humans are great at forming opinions. We will hear something, we'll hear about dihydrogen monoxide, we'll hear about cloning, and based on everything that's been in our experience, based on things that were never meant to tell us about what real cloning is, based on science fiction, we will think, aha, I know what cloning is, and we'll let that assumption ride. But the message that I give when I give this talk publicly at the end is, okay, remember that first slide, the scientist announces something, and he assumes the people go crazy. What should happen and what can happen is that a scientist makes a discovery, announces it to the world, and that the response should be, and you can work on this, that the next step people should want to do is immediately go and learn more about what just happened. More information is always better than less information. It can't be wrong. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions. Any questions in the last 2 or 3 minutes? Yes.
So about the cloning part, you do a survey, or does any survey done about what people's perception on bananas being mostly clones?
Oh, whether about bananas being mostly, yeah, there are a lot of foods that are monocultures, that are mostly clones, that are, I actually do a lab with, I used to teach students over the summer. I'd have high school kids come to Hopkins, and I would do a lab with them. You can purchase like a kit for $100. You can get this kit where the students are able to pick any food of their choice, extract its DNA, and look for something called the cabbage mosaic virus promoter, which is present in 85% of all cloned foods. And they're not cloned, I'm sorry, genetically engineered is the word I meant to say. So they say, okay, these Doritos, is the corn in them genetically modified? And then they can actually look and see on an electrophoresis gel, is it actually genetically modified? It's, and the booklet that tells you to do this, the very first time I didn't read the booklet. And most of the thing the kids brought in was not genetically modified. I thought, oh, that's weird. And then the booklet says, if you want to make sure the kids find something that's genetically modified, have them bring in corn, especially corn chip snacks, potatoes, and papayas. Those are apparently the big ones. Any other questions? Yes?
One of the comments that I read about was when they were talking about labeling genetically modified, that
Yes.
the farmers in Hawaii were extremely concerned because something like 90% of the crops that they grow in Hawaii are GMOs.
Yes. So I didn't get into GMOs only because it's kind of an additional kettle of fish, but many scientists say that GMOs are safe. I mean, there have been a good couple decades of research on genetically modified foods being given and fed to millions and millions of people without any scientific basis in their being dangerous. But the idea is that why are people afraid? People are asking, why are scientists afraid to label the food genetically modified? Why are farmers afraid? Well, they're afraid because they'll sell less food. Yet in Europe, it's a lot stricter than here. In Europe, there are labels, and the standards are different too. Calling something genetically modified means that it may contain less than X% genetically modified content. And I think in the US that's 5%, in Europe it's 1%, something like that. But it's not mandatory here, and there have been proposals to make it mandatory. I think we probably need to wrap up. But if anyone has other questions, please feel free to come find me afterwards. And I really appreciate the ability to speak to you guys today. Thank you very much.